Good afternoon to you, Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com, here with your Hurricane Outlook and discussion for Thursday, the 19th of July, 2018. Hope you're having a good Thursday afternoon. We got a lot to talk about today. Nothing developing in terms of a true tropical cyclone threat, but I think we may have some activity here along the East Coast that we need to talk about because it will have some impacts. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Eastern Pacific, likewise, nothing happening here of any consequence. Both of these systems really don't have a high chance of developing overall, and so the drought, if you will, of activity throughout this region will continue. Let's go over here and use red for just a little bit. All right, let's also get rid of this tab. We are done with it. The wide shot of the Atlantic Basin, I tell you what, it is definitely, rolled up out here, as we say, for development. Not too unusual, although this is one heck of an outbreak of dust and dry air coming off the coast of Africa. The intertropical convergent zone down here just squashed as very strong high pressure and the African Saharan air layer, etc. All of this dominating the Atlantic, and this is going to be the pattern for the next week or so. Towards the end of the month into July, it looks like things, into August, things might start to change, but that's later. We'll worry about later. Right now, let's just take a look at what is happening, and that's a whole bunch of nothing. You can definitely see the outline of the dust, and there's some residual even over Texas where it's really hot. We've got this frontal boundary and these waves of low pressure that are going to try to develop, and that's where we will head in just a few minutes in terms of talking about what looks like it's going to take shape off the Carolina coast and then head up to somewhere off the coast of the Northeast. All right, we'll get to that, though. So first, I wanted to show you this, the Southern Oscillation Index continuing to rise. That's not an El Nino. It's just not. Look at that. It was pretty low, below the -7 threshold that we look for when determining if the atmosphere is in the mood for an El Nino, I guess is a good way to put it. The 90-day, fairly steady overall, especially lately, kind of a flat signature. But notice in here today's contributor, a healthy 11, and the 90-day is up to negative 2.22, and then the 30-day is negative 1.14. So bottom line is continuing the speed bump in the tropical Pacific by way of rising overall values of the SOI, and it just tells me that the El Nino that's been talked about a lot is not happening in any fast order. And we can see that on today's update from the very famous, because I say it is, at least I reference this a lot, NOAA-NESDIS chart. And I'm going to put off my tutorial on how all of this is derived until next week, because we've got some other things to talk about this week that are more pressing, so we'll hold off when there's not as much to talk about. But this is just one of the ways the NOAA-NESDIS, basically the background, how do you get the averages to be a departure from? And we'll talk about that in more detail next week. There's the Reynolds method from the National Hurricane Center, which is more of a weekly average. This is a daily snapshot. And then there's the CDAS, or what we call CDAS version, and we'll talk about it next week. Anyway, this updated today, and again, the main development region warming up. The overall AMO horseshoe that was all cold, and I'll show you. I'm going to continue to show you the contrasting, June 4th and then today, just to hammer that point that we have definitely warmed things up. In the tropical Pacific, a little bit of warming, certainly down here along the equatorial region, but nothing anywhere approaching the El Nino levels, certainly not enough to squash the Atlantic hurricane season, it wouldn't seem. And so let's take a look back real quick. This is what it looks like today. This is what it looked like on July 2nd when Colorado State University, Dr. Phil Klotzbach, lowered the overall forecast numbers and basically said we're going to have a below average Atlantic season. And so since July 2nd, kind of changeable in the Atlantic, I would say. Not too dramatic since then, but boy, I tell you what, you go back to June when the season started, and yes, it is a dramatic change in terms of Atlantic sea surface temperatures. Overall, the Pacific warmed, generally speaking, but again, it's not overwhelming. We're not seeing this dramatic, incredible rise in overall anomalies, departures from normal, compared to the first part of the season. So just keeping an eye on this, as we always like to do. Next time we will visit this is Monday, and then probably next Thursday we'll go into a tutorial on, maybe I have some Saharan dust in my throat, on how these sea surface temperature anomalies are derived. Where do they come from? All right, so the actual temperatures, I like this from, again, this is the Reynolds method here, the daily sea surface temperature, and this was updated yesterday. It's about a day lag behind. And so what are we looking for? Generally speaking, 26 degrees Celsius, universally thought of as the minimum threshold for most tropical cyclone activity. Not all of it, because sometimes the atmosphere can be really, really cold high up, and you can have water temperatures 24, 25 Celsius, even colder than that, mid-70s Fahrenheit, and because of that very cold atmosphere creating a lot more instability, you kind of jumpstart things without the necessary ingredients of a very warm ocean. But that's a story for another day. Generally speaking, for hurricane development, you got to have 26 Celsius minimum. And that line right there, what we call an isotherm, is about like that. Okay, so I'm just going to outline it, that everything south of that line, I guess you could say, and west, to an extent, all this, and then all over here, ready for hurricanes. So the Atlantic is not cold. Not in the main development region, which is all of this area through here. It's not cold. It's a little bit below normal. It's averaging about 1/4 degree Celsius below normal. That's not that cold, okay? So I'm seeing some tweets again about the Atlantic is cold. You know where the Atlantic is cold? Up here, where it should be. And even parts of this where the Gulf Stream kind of disappears, but, it's not that cold. But folks down in the tropics, it's not cold, okay? And we're closing in on a month, maybe less than a month, before the season really starts to kick in. Ocean heat content, I think, more important overall than the skin of the ocean, which is where sea surface temperatures are generally derived. Now we're looking deep into the ocean. How far down does that warm water extend? And this map shows us that. Some decent amounts of heat content here, starting to show up at the lower end of the scale. And what does this mean exactly and all that? Well, you want to get bored, I could go into it, but for the simplicity of, I want to hit the broadest audience possible. Basically, the higher up you go on the scale, the more upper ocean heat content there is in the ocean, meaning that it's not just at the surface. As an example, in some cases, the 80-degree line, or what we call the 80-degree isotherm, will extend down into the ocean 50 meters, maybe 100 meters, so that when the ocean is churned and whipped by a hurricane or a tropical storm, it's just churning and whipping more. Remember that Family Guy episode, Cool Whip? My mind is always on sweet desserts, isn't it? Not always, just kidding. But back to the subject at hand. I got distracted. Thanks, Family Guy. But seriously, when it gets whipped up, you're just whipping up more warm water. All right. Now, sometimes the cyclone will sit and spin over the same area, and eventually it'll exhaust that warm water like Chris did right over here. But overall, folks, when you see all this heat content, there you go. Everything over in this area is ready for a hurricane if the other ingredients are there. Water temperature-wise, we're in the ballpark for most of the Atlantic basin. It's not cold. All right, so some talk, maybe a lot of talk, about something trying to develop from a wave of low pressure that's going to get going maybe out of the Gulf and then coming up. I've seen different genesis points for it, but generally speaking, it really gets going here on the North Carolina Outer Banks, which is where we see nor'easters, the really powerful winds, especially in the winter, get their start. But sometimes in the summer, the atmosphere will conspire with the ocean over here. You get this energy that comes down, and it's called baroclinic processes, and you get the atmosphere involved to kickstart a low-pressure area rather than the latent heat of the ocean itself producing it. And you get sort of a hybrid storm because the water temperatures in this area off the East Coast are not that warm. They're not 80, 81 degrees or whatever. Not off of Jersey or New Jersey, to put it properly, or south of Long Island. They're warm, and we're going to look at that in a moment. But I'm not sure what's going to happen with this in terms of the classification. But I'm here to tell you a storm is going to form in this vicinity, and then is going to track up the East Coast somewhere, and it will bring gale conditions, 40, 50 mile per hour winds, maybe higher, a storm surge to some locations, heavy rain, beach erosion, small craft advisories, gale warnings, maybe even storm warnings. But does it become a textbook classified tropical cyclone? I don't know. But that doesn't matter, because the impacts are going to be the same, except maybe a little bit cooler than you would see a hurricane. Does that make sense? So let's talk about it. Now, I'll tell you right off, the GFS doesn't seem to have the best handle, in my opinion. So I'm going to show you the latest Euro is rendering out now, but there's about 3 days worth of frames that I can show you through the next 72 hours. This is the initial map from tropicaltidbits.com right in there, Levi Cowan's site. And what are we looking at? This is the 5,000 foot level and the vorticity in the atmosphere. This represents energy. Here's some energy spread out over a large area. You get the idea. So let's move on through. This is the initial map. This is 24 hours out. And you can see, what is this, valid tomorrow, 8 a.m. Eastern Time, right there off the South Carolina coast, probably coming up out of the Gulf from somewhere, the Northeast Gulf. Now you start to see a little bit of energy starting to bundle down there in the coastal sections of South Carolina. So if we go down next to 48 hours, there it is trying to coalesce off the North Carolina Outer Banks, where, yes, water temperatures are generally warm enough for warm core tropical cyclone processes to take shape. So we'll just have to see. Kind of a rough day coming up on Saturday, Friday night into Saturday, for portions of the Outer Banks, eastern North Carolina, South Carolina. So be ready for that. A lot of people heading to the beach. Sorry, got bad news. If you want to head to the beach, it's going to be kind of rough this weekend. Not a good beach weekend. But by Sunday, the system moves pretty quickly to a position off of Long Island, right up here in New Jersey, as you can see. And let's use a different color so that it'll stand out. So this represents fairly bundled energy, but not your classic tropical storm look. Got this sort of tail on this side. It just tells me a hybrid. That's the classification part, though. You understand? That's like, what scientists would call it. I'm a scientist, but I'm just saying, don't worry about that, though. What's going to happen is, a heck of a storm up here. And if it was February, yikes, it would probably be a blockbuster blizzard, if there was enough cold air or whatever. So take this seriously, but don't worry that it's going to be a hurricane or anything. But also, I don't want it downplayed as being a non-event. Oh, just because it's not a tropical storm, per se. In other words, if it doesn't get the name, what's the next one, Debbie? Who cares? It's still going to bring some nasty conditions, and I want you to be aware of that. What those conditions are, that's going to take a little time to figure out, because I need the models to come into better agreement. The global forecast system, the GFS, is more inland with its track, as I recall, and so that's not helpful. But generally speaking, the Euro, the North American model, the NAM, and the UK Met, which does indicate that it's a tropical cyclone for what it's worth. Keep this offshore, and it could crank up. And I'm thinking about heading out there for it. Stay tuned for that tomorrow. I'll talk about it more in a minute before I sign off here. So let's look. What are the odds that this tries to do something more tropical, I guess you would say? Well, here is your, let's see, 26 degrees Celsius line right there. All this yellow. And there's 25C, right? I think I got that right. And then, right up here east of New Jersey and south of Long Island, 23 Celsius, 22 Celsius. What is that? We're talking about low to mid 70s Fahrenheit. Not a lot of latent heat in that water. So in terms of this becoming, a tried and true tropical cyclone, hung up on that definition, tropical storm, probably not. However, you folks here, especially eastern Long Island, parts of southern New England here, southeast New England, the Cape, you could get some storm surge and beach erosion a foot or two above normal levels, maybe. Definitely some big waves, 6 feet, 9 feet, maybe 11 feet in some cases. Yeah, so please, don't, I'm just trying to balance what it is versus what it isn't. And if it doesn't get the words versus, I caught that. What it is versus what it isn't, and even though it won't have a name probably, you guys up here do need to take precautions and be aware of it. Because there's a lot of people heading to the beach, a lot of people already at the beach, and a lot of people live out here, period. So I'm thinking about it, and I got to think about it and then do something tomorrow. I don't have the Chevy Tahoe anymore. Well, I do, but it's not functional. So I have to rent something if I'm going to go anywhere. It's just better that way. I have to. Get my equipment together. Yeah, probably go out, if I'm going to go, maybe set some equipment up here in New Jersey and then try to get out here to eastern Long Island. Probably going to be difficult to get over here. I'm only one person, but covering this in eastern to central Long Island, and maybe, like I said, a camera somewhere along the Jersey coast. Maybe I can meet up with my friend Mike Adams from Atlantic City. You never know. So I'll talk about that if I'm going to do that tomorrow. And I got to go tomorrow afternoon, get on the road, get ahead of this thing. I would love to go out to the Outer Banks first, where this looks like it'll take shape, but there just may not be enough time to do it all, where I think the maximum impact is going to be somewhere up in this area from this system. So we'll see. Let's see what the overnight models do and the forecast discussions, etc., from the Weather Service offices, and we'll go from there. A quick reminder, I am on Patreon. The more I read about this, the more I'm excited about it. Creators, musicians, podcast folks, animators, people that do just news and events, really famous people on YouTube especially, seem to be doing well with this as a way for you to directly support, be a patron of their work. And so I'm on there. I've been on there for a couple of years, but the last few weeks, as the hurricane season started, it really started to grow because I'm going to try to focus most of my energy on making this the way that I'm funded. There's been sponsorships in the past, which were great. I'm not knocking that. But there is something even more magical, honestly. And the other people that are on Patreon and the YouTube, the million-plus subscriber YouTubers, and even the six-figure subscriber YouTubers, they'll tell you that when you work for, quote-unquote, all those people, it's really, really fulfilling. Not that, having a sponsorship from, the Acme company for $100,000 a year wouldn't be, but man, there's just something about saying, hey, who do you work for? Well, I work for all the people that support what I do. There's just something about that, honestly. So check it out, whether it's $1 all the way up to whatever. We have all these awesome levels. I am on Patreon, and it's definitely making a difference. Some of that equipment I might be putting into work over the next few days here. We've purchased some equipment from the last couple of months of the income that was generated directly from our supporters. How awesome is that? I think it's great. And it helps to pay the bills, too, which keeps the wife and the kids happy and fed, and I can do my part. Anyhow, yeah, we'll see what's happening with this storm system, whatever. And I'll do an update in the morning. I'll tell you that right now. And then I might be hitting the road tomorrow afternoon for the Northeast. And at the very least, I'll say this. It would be a good practice run for some of the equipment that I'm using. And it's going to be a coastal impact event, a cover the winter storms. Why not this? You know, I'm not going to be one of these people that says, oh, if it's not a hurricane, I don't care. Nothing could be further from the truth. I do care. And with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in. I am Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. Thanks, as always, for watching. I'll have more for you starting tomorrow morning.